Well, Dr. Hartenburg has graciously agreed to come back for a discussion on happiness and friendship, since we didn't get to that on our regular podcast. And so for this bonus episode, he's graciously agreed to come back on and have a conversation with me. And I'm really excited about it because I've been diving a little more deeply into his book that I want to continue to promote at Aristotle Education for Virtue and Leisure. And the messages on happiness and friendship, which we didn't really get to talk a lot about in the podcast, that I think are very foundational to Aristotelian understanding and teaching in the classroom, teaching at home, and the enjoyment of learning and how important that is. And I'd like to start off just by rereading, which I read in the podcast, the last paragraph of his book, because it's incredibly important to tying up this idea of happiness and friendship. He says in his book, when given its central place in education, the subject of friendship has a way of revealing inadequate philosophies of education, which often are preoccupied with the formal education of children and young adults. However, the education that takes place up to the age of 21 is, from a certain point of view, only preparation for the education that takes place informally after that through music, friendship, and if all goes well, philosophy. Those who educate in formal settings should not presume that they are putting the finishing touches on their students. As much as possible in this world full of exile and solitude, teachers should seek to make their students ready to develop genuine friendships. For only fully educated friends with phronesis as their ally will conquer illiberality and ignorance. And I love that you closed out the whole book like that because it just brings you back to how important happiness and friendship is, according to Aristotle. And I feel, and I said this on the podcast, Gary, I feel that friendship is not emphasized ever really in anybody's formal definitions of what a classical education is.
Hmm.
And yet I see, as I read your book and after our podcast interview, I went back to my Aristotle's Politics. I went back to Aristotle on Poetics. I wrote a newsletter on mimetic teaching, and I'm seeing a really rich understanding that I think is lacking in the classical education world on how important happiness and friendship is. So I want to just dive into that with you and hear your thoughts, expanding on what's in your book and how important that is to classical education. So why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. It's, I think, a really good question, and it's one that, especially the way that friendship is related to Aristotle's philosophy of education, I don't think I really appreciated until I started reading and researching for the book. But it might help to back up a little bit and talk about Aristotle's ethics in general. So Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he sets out this idea that everybody wants to be happy. He says no one disputes that. The real disputes are about what that means, like what happiness actually is.
Mhm.
And so in his book, and then in mine, I try to explain his views. He thinks that ultimately happiness in its highest form comes down to living a life of philosophical contemplation. Now, in the Politics, he seems to maybe widen the scope of that to include what he would call a life that allows for appreciation of things like music. And he likes music as an example and sometimes as a paradigm, because music is one of those things that if you understand it, if you appreciate it and you enjoy it, you also are aware that there's no further thing beyond the music, beyond the understanding of it, beyond the appreciation of it, that there's nothing beyond that, right? There's just, you enjoy, you love the music, you love, in his case, right, you love hearing the recitations from the stories of Homer,
Mhm.
surrounded by your friends in a nice sort of setting with, in his food and wine, right? He says, there's, but you don't love that for the sake of something else, right? You love that, you enjoy that for its own sake, and that's it. There's nothing beyond that. Um, so now the life of philosophy, he thinks, is a little better than that because you don't need all these other accoutrements, right? You don't need uh, a gifted singer, right? You just need yourself to be able to think about, to contemplate, discuss, argue about sort of the highest truths of philosophy. Now, he also thinks of philosophy in a way that overlaps a little bit with later Christians thinking about theology, right? Because for him, philosophy in its highest sense is just thinking about God. And he characterized God as the unmoved mover, right? Not necessarily as a person or anything beyond that, but just the highest form of being that there is. That's what he thought philosophy was. So then, if you go
right,
back,
and I want to mention is so this is where my understanding of Aquinas is very limited, but what I think I understand is that this is where Aquinas, and I guess even Boethius was trying to do, was to take, I could be wrong, but was to kind of take Aristotelian philosophy and bring it into theology.
Aquinas, yeah, in particular,
Mm-hmm.
and he was. So in my book, I've got a short chapter. It's a complicated history, Aquinas and Aristotle, and the short version of it is Plato's philosophy, in a form that got called Neoplatonism, was the standard philosophy that was behind a lot of the theology that took place from the early church, writers like Augustine, up through Aquinas, and Aquinas is writing in the 1200s. So you got about not quite 1,000 years, 800 years of Neoplatonic philosophy that's undergirding a Christian theology for the most part.
Would you define Neoplatonic?
So sure, the basic idea of, yeah, is anything else I can get for you? It's sort of so yeah, I'm reading a book right now that's a couple 100 pages thick on just what is Christian Platonism, and Neoplatonism. So, but the basic idea for Platonism is that there is a transcendent realm, and that this world that we live in and think of as real is actually not the most real thing, but the transcendent realm that gives sort of existence and being and sustains this world. That's the actual real world. And we are aware of that more transcendent world through thinking about it, right? We can't see it, but we can think about it. So that's probably the foundation of Platonism. And then Neoplatonism comes along a couple, depending on how you count it, a couple hundred years later. The main figure here is a philosopher named Plotinus. And he develops this into a fairly elaborate philosophical, sometimes theological system, making many more distinctions than Plato did in his own works. But the basic idea is still the same, that there's this transcendent realm. Now, Aristotle sort of famously disagreed with Plato about this, right? Aristotle didn't think that there was a transcendent realm in the way that Plato did. Aristotle is sometimes referred to as an empiricist for this reason, because he thought that the things that you see with your eyes and that you hear with your ears, that is a pretty sure guide to what's real. Now, he also believed in immaterial aspects of this, but in his language, he didn't put those immaterial aspects of reality sort of way off, farther above above us in some transcendent realm that was separate. So yeah, I don't know if that gets to it. Now, if we go back to Aquinas and Christian theology, Aquinas is also a kind of Neoplatonist, right? He thinks of God, for example, as totally transcendent, and the supporter, the sustainer this world, this universe that we see. But he also is trying to incorporate Aristotle into that framework as well. And so in his Ethics, for example, Aquinas is, I think, draws more on Aristotle than Plato, although
Hmm.
Plato and Aristotle don't, sometimes people overstate the differences between them. I tend to think that they agree more than they disagree, but they do have their disagreements. But
Yeah.
the ethics, yeah, is not necessarily one of the main ways that they do.
Yeah, I see that. And one of the things was seeing in the just recent rereading of sections is how this idea of happiness and friendship really is a musical education, in the sense that Plato was talking about a musical education, and that children, poetry is music, and the idea of poesis and all of that is so, it's such a beautiful big perspective, and we don't necessarily look at, if we think of a musical education, we think of music, we don't really
Right,
understand that that means so much more than just
right.
listening to good music
Yeah,
and playing an instrument or singing. It's
yeah,
more about bringing in the beauty, um and Homer is poetry, but
right, right.
it's more than that, really. It's a lot more than
Yeah,
that.
I think you can't go wrong if you just remember that for Plato and Aristotle and the other Greeks, when you say music, you mean something roughly like Homer, right?
Hmm.
Where there's poetry, but it's got a rhythm to it. There's a compelling story also intertwined with this. So things like story, harmony, melody, right? Because Homer would have been sung, right? Not
Right.
necessarily even just recited, and so they're usually accompanied by a musical instrument. So that's going to be part of it. And it's also, in a sense, the subject matter. We think of like, well, the Iliad, the Odyssey. Okay, those are great stories, but in a way, that Homer was the story, right? It's kind of like the central document of Greek culture. At least during the time of Plato and Aristotle, right? You could think of it as kind of the founding document, a document in quotation marks, kind of. So yeah, I think you can't go wrong thinking about music in that term, in those terms. One thing I wanted to get back to, um, so we talked about Aristotle's view of the contemplative life
Hmm.
as kind of the highest form of happiness. Right? So two things you need in order to live this contemplative life. You have to be a good person. So in he explains this in terms of acquiring the virtues. So things like character education, they're
Hmm.
kind of in the ballpark of what Aristotle means here. So Aristotle has a number of about 12 or even 14 virtues that he names, that he thinks you need to develop and inculcate within yourself. But the main ones are things like courage, justice, wisdom, and moderation. The big four, as it were, that he also gets from Plato. Um, and there are others as well. But you become a good person by acquiring and developing those virtues. So that's
Right.
one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I was preparing my newsletter for on mimetic teaching, what I really saw, how I saw tied to virtue and happiness, was this idea that as humans, it's our nature to imitate things, and how important it is, and this is also Platonic, how important it is to put the good and the true and the beautiful examples of music, or looking at pictures before a student, because if you put the bad stuff, they're going to imitate the bad, but they
Right.
take
Right.
pleasure in that. We as humans take pleasure in music. We take pleasure in looking at beautiful things and listening to beautiful things.
Mhm.
He specifically says the young should not study the paintings of Poussin. Like, so he's
Right.
saying,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, like, don't study the bad things, but study the good things, and that there's pleasure in this. And I got to, and he actually, this is another part that he says, it's in book 8 chapter 5 of Politics, and he says, since music belongs accidentally among pleasant things, And virtue is connected with enjoying in correct fashion and feeling affection and hatred. It is therefore clear that one should learn and become habituated to do nothing so much as to judging in correct fashion of and enjoying respectable characters and noble actions. What I saw in that was, okay, this is habit training towards virtue, but it's done in a pleasurable way. And we don't often think of habit training as being something pleasant, but
Right,
it
right.
is. But if we do it this way, we're actually helping to order the affections of the student towards something that's beautiful in a way that's enjoyable. That's where I think there's a foundation of helping students love learning.
Mhm.
At the same time, they're developing the virtue of the good, the true, and the beautiful by nature of looking at art that's good and true and beautiful, that's reflective of justice and love and of these virtues. And so, anyhow, that really struck me as, oh, yeah, habit training can be pleasurable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He says in that passage you quoted, right, that music, just like music is sort of accidentally connected with pleasure. And there he doesn't mean like, oh, it just happens that way. But that's not the essence of music, is to be pleasurable, but it also is pleasurable.
Hmm.
Um, uh, but he also thinks that sometimes education is painful.
Hmm.
So there's this, I think, in his mind, balance, right? Just like, for example, when we are, say, someone is who is not courageous, is learning to be, at least they're trying to be courageous, and they're learning to be a little more courageous than they are. That's gonna, be a little painful or uncomfortable for them to do courageous actions, right? To
Sure.
kind of steel
Yeah.
themselves up. And Aristotle is always asking us to compare those sorts of situations with, well, then think about the person who actually is courageous. They they don't have to steel themselves up to do the courageous, difficult thing. They just do it, right? It's part
That's
of their
a
nature.
great point. I love that. I
And
love
that's
that.
where the pleasure comes in, right?
Right.
The doing the courageous thing. How do you, one thing you might put it this way, how do you know if you actually have the virtue of courage? Is it more or less pleasant for you to do the courageous thing? Um, and Aristotle understands there's all sorts of distinctions here, right? So he's not necessarily saying that the person who does the courageous action, again, the soldier, right, isn't going to feel afraid. No, he will feel afraid. He'll feel fear, though, right, in the appropriate way. But I think Aristotle says, along with that fear, he will also experience a certain kind of pleasure that comes from doing the courageous action. And likewise for things like justice. The just judge, and is Aristotle's usual paradigm, right, will find it pleasant to enact the just decisions and laws and sorts of things. That doesn't mean that's the only thing that he's feeling or experiencing, but it will be pleasant rather than unpleasant.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so all of these virtues, and there, he breaks them down into, there's virtues of character. These are the ones like courage and moderation primarily. And then there's, I guess, what we could call a kind of social virtue, and that's the virtue of justice. Although you can lump justice in with the virtues of character, but it has a social element that the others don't. And then there's the virtues of the intellect,
Hmm.
and this is where phronesis, wisdom, practical wisdom, theoretical wisdom, in a way, that's where all of that comes in. And you get those by being instructed in them. And so it's not so much practice, although phronesis, the practical judgment, that requires a lot of practice and examples, life experience, he says. That's why young people aren't wise, because they haven't had enough life experience, right, to develop their wisdom. Um,
Yeah,
but as
when we
educators,
were in our 20s, we thought we were wiser than our
right,
parents.
right, and Aristotle's right with us. I mean, especially on the age sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
He's like, well, when young people are about 18 to 21, they're not yet wise, right? They could be mathematical wizards, because that doesn't take life experience, but they're not going to be wise. That's going to take, I think he thinks maybe 10 or 15 more years of life experience before they're, possible for them to even become wise.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so yeah, the virtues, so those go into what you need in order to be happy. But even the second thing that came to mind, and this is, I think, where friendship comes in, is that the life of contemplation, right? This happiest life that Aristotle thinks everyone ought to aim at. You need friends, right? You can't live the contemplative life by yourself. So sometimes people think they hear something like the reflective life or the contemplative life, and they think, oh, I got to go be a hermit, just isolated. And that's not Aristotle's idea. You need friends to have conversations about the highest things of philosophy and theology, um, and to understand it, right? And so, yeah, so if you're going to help students learn to be good, right, one of the things you're going to try to teach them, or at least prepare them to be, is prepare them to be a good friend.
Mhm,
I think
mhm,
this is a challenge. You were mentioning, this is a challenge for educators.
mhm.
I think mostly because, though, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts on it. I think mostly because you can't do this directly.
Hmm.
You have to come about this indirectly. First of all, by focusing on the virtues, right? That's what makes people capable of being good friends. And so you focus on the virtues, and Aristotle says things like, young people at first form friendships on the basis of pleasure. Um,
Mhm.
they enjoy spending time together and getting to know one another. He doesn't condemn that, but he does say that's not going to make for long-term, genuine friendship. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Did you have any thoughts about why you think friendship is maybe difficult for educators, teachers in particular, to include as a kind of learning objective, right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I feel that in my work with classical schools, it's not really a topic that ever comes up. And I guess I wanted to to sort of discuss with you, like, it seems like it's very difficult in the culture we live in today to form true friendships. I
Mhm,
think some of that could be just, our very casual way of, "Hey, how's it going? How are you today?" Like, nobody really wants to know, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
so we have such a independent nature as Americans. Our forefathers came to this country.
mhm.
It's all about independent, be independent, be independent. And then this polite way of, "Hey, how's it going? How are you today?" type of thing sets up a very superficial way of relating to one another. And I think that it would be helpful for teachers to know how they can help children develop real friendships in an Aristotelian sense in the school. How a school can develop a friendship culture, if you will, in this
Uh,
Aristotelian
yeah,
sense.
no, I think that's a really good way to put it. How can schools develop a friendship culture? Um, so Yeah, one thing that sort of got me thinking along these lines was I heard a good talk about C.S. Lewis's educational experience. And one thing that the speaker mentioned was that the essential aspects of Lewis's education were sort of the subjects that he studied and so forth, but also the kind of in between times, right, where Lewis formed friendships with other students, right, or other people, um, but sort of outside the classroom, or even in
Yeah.
some senses like breaking the rules, right? And one thing I took away from reflecting on his experience was in my own educational programs, I can't like fill up a student's day, or I shouldn't cram as much as I can into the student experience as I can. I need to leave space for them to, to grow and develop friendships. So one thing, just practically, in the honors college where I teach, at the end of every semester, our students do an oral final exam. And for most of them, it's just a half an hour where they meet with two professors who ask them questions about what they've learned. And so a half an hour would not, I mean, we have a whole semester's worth of great books and ideas to talk about. There's no way we can do that. So what I tell the students is, you're going to spend, I don't know, some of our students spend 20 hours, 40 hours over the course of a semester preparing for this half-hour conversation. But if they spend that time mostly talking with their fellow students, right, that's something I'm never going to assess, but I've really encouraged them to do that, right? So we'll talk about for a half an hour, and that will sort of be what we assess, but that's maybe not even scratching the surface of the value of this for you. The real value is you spending time with your classmates, reviewing this material, thinking about the ideas, discussing, debating, and doing that not in the classroom, not under any teacher's supervision, but just on your own with your friends. And so that's one way in which I try, as I can, to encourage students, and I encourage others to not cram so much stuff into a student's education that you just disrupt, their time for forming friendships, or you just crowd it out. I mean, if you're structuring your school day, and if you think about it, when are my students going to have time to make friends? Well, maybe like if they're in a traditional school, that 10 minutes between classes, or at lunchtime for 45 minutes. You think, really, that's going to be enough time for them to really establish good friendships? So I think the scheduling thing is part of that. I also know that idle hands are the devil's workshop too, right? I mean, there's wisdom in that. So I'm not saying just let your students sort of run wild the whole time, but we've got to leave space in between what we are sort of officially including in the curriculum for students to get to know each other and make friends.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Yeah, I think that parents and teachers are really up against an interesting battle that I wasn't really up against, and in this whole social media and this online learning platforms that we have, that I think are very detrimental to this Aristotelian idea of friendship. Very concerned about it. And I know you mentioned something at the conference of just what you've seen in the last, I think, 5 years of students being very depressed. And it
Depressed and
sounded
anxious.
like, yeah, it sounded like, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, but it almost sounds to me like this is an epidemic of a lack of Aristotelian friendship.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I think that would oversimplify it. But so one thing I will say is that it's so in my experience, so I teach undergraduates at Houston Baptist University, and was a pretty diverse student body. And I talk to colleagues across the university or at other universities, and they are mentioning this. They're seeing the same things, like more students come in dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, those two things in particular. The thing I find really interesting is it doesn't matter where the student went to school or what kind of school they were in. It's not like all the depressed, anxious students are coming from public schools, and the students who are coming from private schools or Christian schools or home schools, it's not like those students are doing any better. Now, not everyone is sort of, not all the students are sort of struggling with these things. Many of them aren't. But the kind of distribution of them seems to me pretty uniform across. It doesn't matter what kind of school you went to. So one thing that tells me is that whatever is bringing this about, it's not being helped by the kind of school that a student is attending in their primary and secondary grades. And one thing I encouraged educators at that conference we were at in Austin with the CLT to think about is how can you should go back and evaluate your school, and we should all do this, right? Am I graduating students with lower levels of anxiety and depression? If not, why not? What am I doing? What's the family life like, right? Because the school's only one part of it. You mentioned social media, that's a big part of it. So yeah, I think, if students had more time, I think the time and the stress and the pressure and parents and educators having, I think, misplaced priorities. It's a so we celebrate, that my student from my homeschool student got into this prestigious university. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, but what if they're just crippled by anxiety when they get to that prestigious university? Like, what have you done for them?
Right.
I don't think that trade-off's worth it. But I, in a sense, understand why parents do that in schools. And at the time, it almost seems like the most natural thing to do. Oh, let's have high standards. Let's make sure our students are taking all the difficult math and science and Latin that they can. And let's really sort of cram them full of extracurriculars so they have a chance at admission at a prestigious place. And then when they get there, sometimes they can't function because they can't get out of bed because they're depressed because they don't know what to do now. They've made it.
You mentioned, I think, the increase of staff that your school has had to, or maybe it wasn't.
Not just my school, everybody's school.
Yeah, tell our audience a little bit about that. What you've noticed.
So the point I would just like to make is lots of different people complain, sometimes rightly so, about what's known as administrative bloat in higher education, right? We're offering more services to students. So we're not necessarily getting more teachers or professors, but we're hiring more people to run programs at the university. And some of those programs, okay, are they essential to the university? Maybe not. We can have that debate. And I don't really want to sort of get into that. But what I do think is, I don't know of any school that couldn't double, for example, any university, or college, that couldn't double the staff in their student counseling centers and still have waiting lists for students who need counseling sessions. Christian universities, public universities, private universities, right? I talk to students, I need to see a counselor, but they're booked up, right? And not just at my university, but all of them. So there is administrative bloat, but also we need more people in our counseling centers to help students deal with what they're going through. So that's just my experience as kind of a professor on what I sometimes think of as the front lines, or I'm seeing the products of various attempts at K through 12 education. And I'm just reporting back my experience.
Right. And you've been teaching for how long? And when did you notice this increase?
In universities, I've been teaching, I started as an adjunct almost 20 years ago. And I would say that within the last 5 years or so.
So before COVID.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So
COVID kind of accelerated.
Sure. It's not just a COVID reaction, it's before COVID. So, Gary, would you share with our listeners, if you're comfortable, what are you and your wife doing to prevent this from happening to your children?
Ah, yeah, so my wife and I homeschool, um, and my wife developed a homeschool collaborative program called Bluebonnet Home Scholars Collaborative. It's a local program here in the Houston area. Um, and so I think one thing we're doing is it's a kind of it's a hybrid of a lot of things. So it's for homeschool students, um, but it also has elements of the university model,
Hmm.
which I think more families, if they can afford it in many different senses of afford, not just money. Um, but I think that has benefits for students, right? Not being in a school building, um, 40 hours a week or more, but being able to be home. But also, and we found sort of ways that work for us. Yeah, and look, these aren't new things that homeschoolers or other educators have never thought of before, right? So
Right.
we kind of do math as it like all year round.
Hmm.
We do this, my kids do take breaks, but right. So a little math the whole year we found is more relaxing, and it still can be stressful, right? I mean, but it's more relaxing than trying to do a lot of math just during the school year. And that's not rocket science. Having the sort of Charlotte Mason influence of spending lots of time outdoors.
Hmm.
So the church where my wife's program meets has a lot of green space around it. It's in the suburbs, and so there's actually an airport near a regional airport nearby. And sometimes I lead discussion classes, and we try and have class outside as much as possible. We don't need a blackboard or any fancy apparatus for the education. And we have to pause when an airplane flies overhead. It would be nice to be further out in the country. Um, but being outdoors, I think shown benefits for kids.
Yeah.
And I think it's important not to dogmatize about these things, because the history of education, if it shows anything, it shows that students can learn in a tremendous variety of settings, right?
That's a great point. Yeah.
So we found something that works for us, and works for plenty of people, but public schools, right? I mean, they're educating students, maybe not the way that everyone would like them to, but I think this is it's an important thing to keep in mind, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
That there's lots of ways to educate and teach that have been successful throughout history.
Hmm.
And sometimes we get a little myopic, historically speaking, about, oh, these must be our options. So, and Aristotle would be a good reminder of that, right? I mean, his curriculum for primary and secondary education was reading, writing, drawing, mathematics, music, and physical education, and maybe like some sports involved. And that was it. That's it.
Hmm.
And then when you're about 18, you graduate. The men at the time would have some compulsory military service for a couple of years. And then if they wanted to pursue formal education, they could, right? At least in the time of Aristotle in Greece. Right? And then they could focus on studying something. But they also, this is something I talk about in my book, they also relied, frankly, on a lot of slave labor to kind of maintain this. And that's something that we don't do.
Right.
And so again, it's like, well, let's do it the Aristotle way. Well, but we both, mom and dad, have to work, right? And we don't have slave labor to sort of sustain just a leisurely life where the income rolls in and we get to
Right.
do whatever we want. No.
I appreciated that part of your book where you brought in the balance of, okay, we don't have slaves and we shouldn't. Women are in the picture here and they should be.
Right.
And
Yeah, that's another way.
I
Yeah.
appreciated how you brought that all together towards the end of the book. It was very well done. I was wondering where you were going to go with that because the whole first part of the book, you were just laying out Aristotle, and it was pretty clear that, oh, well, we're not really like that, and we really don't want to do that. But you
Right.
did a
Yeah.
great
No.
job at the end of saying, well, we really don't want to do that. But, here are the great things from Aristotle that we can learn from. And he definitely has a lot of wisdom that we can glean from.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Mhm. Well, this was great. Thanks so much for having this conversation. And I'm sure it's going to bless a lot
Oh,
of
thank
people.
you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.